Hello YouTube. A report has come out of Sweden called the Swedish Sex Purchase Act Claims Success and Documented Effects. And this report is basically looking at some of the holes in the Swedish Model Report, or what is commonly known as the Swedish Model Report, and the holes in the claims coming out of Sweden that the Swedish model has been successful. I'll put the link in the low bar. I'll also try and remember to include whatever pages I happen to be llooking at if you'd like to follow along. And I also did a video on this before called The Truth About the Swedish Model Report. I believe that's what it was called. And that link will be in the low bar too. So here in the introduction, it starts off basically talking about how Sweden has said that the Swedish model approach, which is basically criminalizing the buyer while supposedly decriminalizing the seller of sexual services, is a unique approach, and that it's really not a unique approach at all. I'm going to be skipping around for the sake of brevity. So further on in the introduction, it says, the Sex Purchase Act was introduced by feminist policymakers who argued that prostitution is a form of male violence against women, that it is physically and psychologically damaging to sell sex, and that there are no women who sell sex voluntarily. Furthermore, it was claimed that if one wants to achieve a gender-equal society, then prostitution must cease to exist, not only for the above-mentioned reasons, but also because women in society are harmed as long as men think they can quote-unquote buy women's bodies. If the ban would have adverse effects for individual women who sell sex, or if it violates their rights to self-determination would not matter, the gender-equal symbolic value of the Sex Purchase Act is more important. Also on page 2, another unique aspect of the Sex Purchase Act is how persistently the ban or the Swedish model has been marketed. One of the stated aims from the very outset was to export it to other countries. Continuing on page 2, at the core of the marketing campaign has been the stated success of the Sex Purchase Act. It is said to have reduced prostitution and trafficking for sexual purposes, to have had a deterrent effect on clients, and to have changed societal attitudes towards prostitution, all without having any negative consequences. Most recently, these claims were stated in the 2010 official evaluation of the Sex Purchase Act and repeated by Minister of Justice Beatrice Ask in an article for CNN. The problem with these claims is that if they are carefully investigated, they do not appear to have been supported by the available facts and research. As soon as the official evaluation was published, it was criticized from several directions. In the consultation process following the publication of the evaluation, the critique was especially harsh from those referral bodies who conducted prostitution research and those working with health and discrimination issues. The criticism has primarily been focused on the evaluation's lack of scientific rigor. It did not have an objective standpoint, since the terms of reference given were that the purchase of sex must continue to be illegal. There was not a satisfying definition of prostitution. It did not take into account ideology, methodology, sources, or possible confounding factors. There were inconsistencies, contradictions, haphazard referencing, irrelevant or flawed comparisons, and conclusions were made without factual backup, and were at times of a speculative character. Continuing on page 3, in this report, we will focus on the conflict between the stated success of the ban and the lack of data that can back up these claims, because when reviewing the research and reports available, it becomes clear that the Sex Purchase Act cannot be said to have decreased prostitution, trafficking for sexual purposes, or had a deterrent effect on clients to the extent claimed. Nor is it possible to claim that the public attitudes towards prostitution have changed significantly in the desired radical feminist direction, or that there has been a similar increased support of the ban. We have also found reports of serious adverse effects of the Sex Purchase Act, especially concerning the health and well-being of sex workers. in spite of the fact that lawmakers stressed the ban would not have a detrimental effect on people in prostitution. The next part of the report, called Swedish Prostitution Policy, goes into detail about exactly what the law entails, and it's not just as simple as it criminalizes the buyer. I'm not going to go into this part, but I do suggest anyone who's really interested in this issue go ahead and read through that part for yourself. We're going to skip forward. On page 7 is a list of the materials and the sources that they used. I'm not going to go into detail to go ahead and try and keep this as short as possible. But as you can see, it is a comprehensive list for anyone who's wondering about the objectiveness or the validity of this report. Now, I'm just going to pick a couple of the flaws in the Swedish Model Report they point out that stood out the most to me. There's a lot more in this, but I'm just going to keep it nice and short. So let's look at the first one here on page 8 when they talk about prevalence. In order to assess whether or not prostitution has decreased since the introduction of the Sex Purchase Act in 1999, one needs to know how prevalent prostitution was before the law was passed. The most frequently used figure indicates that there were about 650 women in street-based prostitution in the 3 largest cities, and it is estimated that 2 to 3 times as many sold sex indoors. This is said to make the total number of sex workers working before the new law passed between 1,850 to 2,500. But sometimes the number 3,000 is used. Now, the importance of this beginning, like this first mistake or hole in the Swedish Model Report that we're looking at, I think is of the utmost importance because, you know, you're talking about your beginning figure, 1,850 to 3,000, having a margin of error of 1,150 sex workers. Your margin of error in your beginning figure is almost half of your figure. And so right there, I mean, you can't possibly know how successful the Sex Purchase Act law was when you don't even have a reliable figure to compare everything since to. Also on page 8, it says there is still a general consensus that street prostitution declined by about half after the introduction of the Sex Purchase Act. The question is whether or not the decline was a direct result of the act or not. Others have pointed out that the estimated numbers of street workers have been declining since the 1970s, suggesting that any observed decline since the act, if there is one, is part of a much larger trend. Furthermore, this trend is not a specifically Swedish phenomenon, as Holstrom points out in the Nick report, but an international one. So basically, this is the typical correlation does not equal causation argument, which if the Swedish Model Report had been a creditable report from the beginning, they would have taken this into account. Plus, you know, street sex work being on the decline in general makes perfect sense because of the internet. Continuing on page 9, there is also some specific objection to the relationship between the ban and its effects on street-based prostitution. According to social workers interviewed by the National Council for Crime Prevention, it has become difficult to count the number of sex workers since they have moved to side streets and cover a larger area than before. Yeah, that sounds real safe. You know, and this just, you know, harkens back to what we've been saying from the beginning. When you criminalize any aspect of sex work, you just push it further underground. Well, in this case, you're pushing it further into the more dangerous side streets. And, you know, just because you put sex workers in a position where they have to hide from you so you don't get to count them does not mean that your little ban is successful. Bottom of page 11. In short, due to methodological problems, there is no way of knowing for certain what has happened after the introduction of the Sex Purchase Act. In its 2007 report, the National Board of Health and Welfare summarized the situation in the following manner. It is also difficult to discern any clear trend of development. Has the extent of prostitution increased or decreased? We cannot give an unambiguous answer to that question. At most, we can discern that street prostitution is slowly returning after swiftly disappearing in the wake of the law against purchasing sexual services. But as said, that refers to street prostitution, which is the most obvious manifestation. With regard to increase and decrease in other areas of prostitution, the hidden prostitution, we are even less able to make any statement. The National Board for Health and Welfare. So let's move on to page 12 under trafficking for sexual purposes. We skip down. According to the National Council for Crime Prevention, the Sex Purchase Act can both be a hindrance to traffickers, but also a tool to improve market conditions due to the higher prices for sex that the ban creates. On the one hand, it can reduce the number of women used in trafficking, but also provide a reasonably good profit for those traffickers that have the capacity to provide sexual services without being caught by authorities. This in turn makes Sweden an attractive country for the more sophisticated criminal. These contradictions can be noted in other documents. In the official evaluation, it stated, according to the Swedish police, it is clear that the ban on the purchase of sexual services acts as a barrier to human traffickers and procurers who are considering establishing themselves in Sweden. The 2010 official evaluation, aka the Swedish Model Report. But in a press release only a few months before the evaluation was published, the same police authority stated, serious organized crime, including prostitution and trafficking, has increased in strength, power, and complexity during the past decade. It constitutes a serious social problem in Sweden, and organized crime makes large amounts of money from the exploitation and trafficking of people under slave-like conditions. National Police Board press released March 2010. So, you have prostitution, a decriminalized prostitution, where it's safer for the women. They can screen their clients more thoroughly before they decide to do business with them, which just promotes safety for sex workers. It also promotes a more positive, less exploitive relationship between the sex workers and the police. You have that safer, decriminalized environment for prostitution. Well, if you criminalize one aspect of that, the buyer, you attack the demand for the safer prostitution, you're going to push that demand down into the black market. And you're just going to make that black market more profitable for pimps and traffickers. 2 is the highly contradictory nature of what these very same police authorities are telling their people. On one hand, they're saying the ban is working, that it's great. But just, in March, they're saying that prostitution and trafficking is getting worse and worse and worse. Which is it? Now we're on pages 12 to 13. If we look at the number of people involved in trafficking for sexual purposes, the discrepancies and uncertainties continues. In its reports from 2002 to 2006, the National Police Board estimated the actual victims of trafficking to be 400 to 600 women. But since 2007, they have not published any numbers on women at all, and not given a reason why. It is also difficult to get hold of a comprehensive list of reported and convicted crimes against traffickers for sexual purposes, despite the many reports the police produce. One has to search in different documents to find all the data. When compiled, they look like this. Number of people reported and convicted for trafficking for sexual purposes. So another thing this study reveals is that according to reports, once compiled, trafficking was never a big problem in Sweden to begin with. So how did they handle this? Here it says, but on the other hand, in its annual report, the National Police Board criticizes the courts for not convicting more people for trafficking. As the National Rapporteur on Trafficking, the board is obliged to annually describe the development of this crime. In the 2006 report, the authority introduced a new term, trafficking like prostitution. There's never a clear definition of the term, but the new category allowed the board to describe more cases in its report. So they weren't catching anybody with their fancy Sex Purchase Act law, so they start making up terms and like they got people now that are trafficked-ish without any clear definition of what trafficked-ish or trafficking-like prostitution means. So you don't catch people, just start making up shit. So we skip down to page 14 here, and it says, does the law deter buyers? The conclusion in most reports and research is that the Sex Purchase Act does not deter clients. To which I say, duh. This reminds me, a couple of weeks ago, Miss Pure Fiction popped in the Skype. She was like, Div, I have a question. I was like, yeah. She said, okay, they say that it's deterring prostitution because they're criminalizing one half of the transaction, the buyer. How do they figure that's going to deter prostitution if here in the U.S. it's completely criminalized, the buyer and the seller, and it doesn't deter shit? And I was just like, oh, you're so cute. You keep asking those questions, sweetie. Yeah, no, don't make sense. The next section down here, page 17, is has the law changed attitudes? I'm not even going to go into that because, frankly, I don't care. I don't care if the law was supposed to change attitudes towards sex workers and towards sex work as far as making it more stigmatized, and I don't care. Plus, you know, I'm not in this to bend to society's already negative attitudes towards sex work. You know, people in the South had a negative attitude towards the integration of schools there. That wouldn't have stopped me then either. So, yeah, I'm going to skip forward. We're going to jump forward to page 21, unintentional effects. There are several reported unintended negative effects of the Sex Purchase Act concerning both sex workers and their clients. The first one here that I will name, and it's a very important one. When it comes to clients, it seems they are less willing to assist as witnesses in cases in which profiteers who exploit the sexual labor of others are persecuted, since they now find themselves guilty of a crime. 2. The most common and perhaps most serious complaint regarding sex workers themselves is that they experienced an increased stigmatization after the introduction of the Sex Purchase Act. Some also state that the ban is a violation of their human rights, and many say that they don't feel fairly or respectfully treated. They were not regarded as fully worthy members of society. Sex workers object to the fact that they were not consulted in the making of the law. Since sex workers feel they are not able to influence their legal or societal situation, they feel powerless, and since the ban builds on the idea that women who sell sex are victims, weak, and exploited, many claim that the law propagates stereotypical notions about sex workers. Bottom of page 21, top of page 22. Third, the National Board of Health and Welfare reported that due to the ban, sex workers feel less trust in social authorities, police, and the legal system. And half of the respondents in the RFSL study say that the current legislation prevents people from seeking help. Instead of the police being the source of protection, sex workers feel haunted by them and are subjected to invasive searches and questioning. There is also the problem in that they are in an unclear legal position. They can be made to testify in a trial, but they neither enjoy the rights of the accused nor of the victim. Some reports Some report that there is an increased dependency on third parties. Now that it is difficult to make direct contact with clients, sellers must rely on agents, pimps, helpers to find clients. And there's more stuff in here, but these are the three main ones that I'm going to discuss now. You know, one, it keeps the clients from trying to help us. And yes, clients do help sex workers. Ask any sex worker, and she'll probably tell you of at least one client who helped her out once or twice. And if that client knows that they could possibly be thrown in jail, they're going to be less likely to stick up for us, at least in court. And two, you know, the increase in stigmatization is something that many antis are probably very thrilled about. But that stigmatization is part of what marks sex workers as acceptable prey for creeps and murderers and rapists and what have you. When they know that we are powerless, they're going to be more likely to target us because they're going to have less to worry about as far as getting busted. And especially if they know that if a client sees something happen to us, well, that client's not going to say anything. That client's worried he's going to go to jail too. And three, you know, people who say they hate pimps, you know, and I'm just talking the stereotypical, you know, pimp here, not the way poorly worded laws have just destroyed the whole meaning of what it means to be a pimp, to make the whole issue more confusing. But just a stereotypical image of a pimp, if that is really what you oppose, then you cannot support this Sex Purchase Act. You cannot support the Swedish model, because making prostitution criminalized on any level pushes prostitutes into a position where they have to depend on those people. If you really don't like pimps, you cannot support this. And this report says it all. They also go on to discuss more adverse effects, particularly concerning STIs. But to keep this short, I'm going to go ahead and skip to the conclusion, which I will read in its entirety. We believe that one has to look at several factors to understand the discrepancy between the stated success of the Sex Purchase Act and its documented effects. While there are some police, social workers, and former sex workers who claim that the ban has indeed helped reduce prostitution and trafficking and deterred clients without any adverse effects, the reports and documents that have a scientific rather than ideological base do not support these success claims. Hence, as we and others have written elsewhere, we believe that it is in the ideological and cultural domain that the creation of the quote-unquote unique Sex Purchase Act and the above-mentioned discrepancy must be found. It has to do with a desire to create and uphold a national identity of being the moral consciousness in the world, with notions or good and bad sexuality, with the horror stigma, with creating new forms of sexual deviancy, with a communitarian rather than a liberal political culture, and perhaps above all, a stereotypical and uniformed understanding of prostitution. Our stance when it comes to policy regarding prostitution is that it has to be based on knowledge rather than morality or radical feminist ideology. We also believe that when policy is developed, the actors at the heart of this policy must be adequately consulted and duly respected. In our opinion, this has not been the case with regards to the Swedish model. Thank you very much for sticking it out with me this long. I know this is kind of a long video. The report will be in the low bar. Please do go and look in depth at the report. I think all the relevant links are in the report if you want to do some further reading on it. And I'll also include links to the other sex workers' rights advocates channels in the low bar, YeOldeHeretic and FeministWhore. Please go subscribe to them. There are not many of us here on YouTube, and you know, in the world, it's also a struggle to get our voices heard and to get the things that we're saying heard. You know, we're fighting an uphill battle here, and we appreciate every bit of your support. I think FeministWhore is also on Twitter. I'll have her Twitter in the low bar, and thank you very much. Good night.